Okay, here we go. Here we go. All right, so just to kind of get an overview of what we've done so far and what we will do in the future, in the first tetralogy, we're asking all the basic questions of what does it mean to be human, right? What does it mean to be educated? What is friendship? What does it mean to live fortitude? What does it mean to become wise? The second tetralogy are the various hypotheses, are the false hypotheses about how to answer these questions. In the third tetralogy, ultimately in Platonic understanding of education, at some point you have to decide what teacher you're going to trust to lead you to the knowledge of higher things. Now, with the Phaedo, we're finishing the fourth tetralogy, and the fourth tetralogy is the tetralogy of the soul. And there's some interesting things about this fourth tetralogy in general, and about the Phaedo in particular. That first of all, if you look at if you count, not that you have time to do any of this, but apparently if you count all of the lines of all of Plato's dialogues, it comes out to like 1,500. And if you divide it in two, you basically get 750. And the 750th page of the dialogues is the death scene of the Phaedo. Is the final, in other words, the final page of the Phaedo is the middle point of the dialogues. So, I don't want to attribute more to that other than Plato, the theory, the kind of working theory of this website that we're using is that Plato, as about a 40-year-old man, he conceived of a work that would take the rest of his life to do, which would be a work that would lead students from the kind of just beginning of knowledge all the way to the highest understanding of the ends of the universe and things like that. And that's the order of the dialogues. So the fourth tetralogy is the tetralogy that introduces to us man as both a material and immaterial being. And the Symposium, the dialogues are basically about eros or love. One of the features of man's soul is that it's capable of love. It has desire. And so probably the most famous section of the Symposium is the dialogue between Diotima and Socrates, where they talk about, from an experiential standpoint, what desire is, how desire is the expectation of receiving some good. And from that notion of desire, they build the understanding of the soul as being spiritual, as the first.
You said desire expectation of receiving some good, and I didn't get the second.
Okay, desire is the expectation of receiving some good. The part of the soul that expects to receive good is the will. That function of the soul is spiritual. It's immaterial. The senses, the passions or the senses, they are what is connected to the body, you might say. The passions or the emotions, they are what connects the body to the soul. There's the physical passions, and then there's also the mental passions. But it's the will that ultimately desires. The the will desires good for itself, but it's not a physical good that it desires, it's a spiritual good. And so the primary desire of the will is a spiritual unity between itself and some other being. So in the Symposium, this is the first aspect of love that is portrayed in the dialogue between Diotima and Socrates. The will as the spiritual part of the soul that desires good for the soul. But the good that it desires is a spiritual good. The intellect is the highest part of the soul, and we didn't really get to that so much in the Symposium, but we start to get introduced to the intellect in the Phaedrus. The Phaedrus presents us with the clash, you might say. The clash between Eros and Logos. In other words, there are many of the dialogues in the Phaedrus. Oh, just to say something as a way of summary of the Symposium, right? That the second aspect of love, the first aspect of love is the union, the spiritual union between the two people. The second aspect of love is procreation, and these two features are the two features of love. Plato or Socrates and Diotima, when they're speaking in the Symposium, they do speak about a kind of greater kind of love being the production of spiritual children of virtue. And so that also is part of the Symposium. The Phaedrus, in the Phaedrus we get a description of the soul. We get a description of the different parts of the soul and their basic relation to one another. Our author here says that if you want to understand the Phaedo in relation to the Phaedrus and the Republic, the Phaedrus is an argument ultimately about how just understanding man as being driven by passion, man still develops the need for logos. Even in the face of instinct or passion, man needs to talk. He needs to understand who he is so that he learns how to love properly. So the Phaedrus shows the conflict between passion and logos. Then, the next dialogue is the Republic. The Republic is the soul in action. Right? It's the soul in action, both in private and in public, that leads to justice. And the root of harmony in the soul and the root of harmony in society is when the soul in action achieves justice. So the whole point of the Republic is to go through the behavior of how the soul should behave. Then the point of the Phaedo. So again, in each tetralogy, we tend to go from the passions up to the logos. So the point of the Phaedo is to try to develop a synthesis of the previous three dialogues by developing what are the principles of how one should lead one's life, given the fact that we will all die. I suppose November is an appropriate month for discussing the Phaedo, because November is the month of the dead, right? So the ultimate point of the Phaedo is that Socrates is reflecting on how we should live our lives in the light of the fact that we will all die. And in light of the fact that we will all die, we need to search for a consistency between our words that we speak, the ultimate end that we are pursuing, and the deeds of justice, right? The deeds that flow, the actions that we do because we are trying to be consistent about our ultimate end and the order of things. Only if we can figure out this will we be able to figure out what true love is and what wisdom is. So are there any, so that's kind of just the general outline of things. Looking at the Phaedo, does anybody have any questions or anything they want to say? Yes.
Is there actually like evidence that these dialogues were like deliberately arranged like this?
Okay, the question is, I'm just going to repeat your question for the sake of our listeners in the audience. The question is there evidence for the dialogues being written in any kind of particular order? Is that an accurate restatement of your question? Well, there are some people, I guess, in his seventh letter, I think I would have to look at this for sure. I haven't looked at it in a while, but I'm pretty sure that in the seventh letter, he hints at, by the time he went back to Athens, when he was 40 or so, he had in his mind an idea of how to educate people. So that's the only evidence, that's the only concrete evidence we have. We don't have any knockdown, drag-out evidence. We don't have an outline of everything that he wrote. Now, this particular author of this website that we've been relying on, he argues that most of the people that have looked at Plato in the past, they have proposed an alternative order of the dialogues based on looking at the chronology of the dialogues, like historical evidence, what the dramatic setting might be. This guy argues that it would be that basically Plato is very good about getting a lot of the history right, but at the same time, that doesn't mean... Oh, the other thing that they look at is they try to understand the... They try to understand like the language that's being used in the dialogue and look for words that developed in a particular year in the 4th century BC that might be an indication of Plato couldn't have written it before that year. You know, so it would be like reading something. It'd be like reading literature and saying, when did the word whack develop? Because someone in the Bronx uses the word whack, right? Man, oh, that man is whack, right? No, that's a word that's used in the Bronx from when I worked there. Well, if we knew that word first appeared in 1994, and then we saw that word in a book, we could speculate that book had to be written after 1994. Well, they do the same thing with Plato's dialogues. What this guy is saying is that, I think what this guy's argument is that you can look at the dialogues thematically, and if you look at them thematically, you can discover an order to them. And that order might also be revealed by literary elements in the dialogues that reveal to us what dialogue came first and which one came second.
It's like words like black.
Right, but not. Yeah. Yeah. So there's no definitive ordering to the dialogues. But this ordering that this guy proposes, this is like the traditional ordering of the dialogues. This is what was around in the year 400 that was written down somewhere, and that was then renewed in the Renaissance. And the argument always was that Plato had an intended or like an educational order to the dialogues. So this order was challenged just as most order was challenged in the 19th century. This order of the dialogues was also challenged in the 19th century. Right? And it was challenged by, just as like with the Bible, the rational critics, or whatever it's called, biblical criticism or historical criticism, just as they challenged a lot of stuff, biblical whack, right? Just as there was biblical whack in the 19th century, there was Platonic whack in the 19th century. Very good, Andrew. Very good.
Well, I thought that's what you were getting at the whole time.
Yeah, I'm glad you picked up on it. Just as there were all these attempts in the 19th century to criticize the order of everything, so too there were these efforts to use the new historical science to critique the order of the dialogues. And that's where a lot of these new hypotheses came up. In fact, I think I know someone who's proposing that the Laws is actually the first. And what the thesis of the guy, the website guy, is that basically Plato had all of the dialogues in mind when he was about 40, and he spent the next 40 years working on them and perfecting them. That he conceived of them as kind of a whole, or he at least conceived of a project as a whole, and then wrote these dialogues to fit into that project.
Does it really matter what order they were written in if they're arranged in a lesson pattern?
Well, that's his whole point. That's his whole point. Is that you could, in other words, he could have written the Alcibiades last, or he could have written the Timaeus last because he perfected the Laws first, but he always intended it to be the last one, and then he wrote the Timaeus afterwards to put some finishing touches on it. Right? So there's all sorts of ways that you could conceive of a potential order of the dialogue, or I guess that's his point. Is that chronologically speaking, you could have a dialogue finished later that's meant to come earlier in this order of things. So does that make sense to everybody? Are there any other questions or comments?
I'm sorry, Sam.
Does anybody want to say anything? Okay. I need to do one thing here. Here we are. We're still here, everybody. For all you out there and all you internet listeners.
You post these on your website, like all of them?
No, I will post this one on my website.
What about the iPod ones?
Yeah, I can post them. I don't want to post them too much because I don't want to get in trouble by because anybody can look at my website. Right? I guess I shouldn't be afraid, but anybody can look at my website. We are still, I think we're still recording here.
Yeah. I do have a question.
Okay, we have a question from the audience.
And it's because I read the Phaedo in a different class last year.
Yes.
And they were talking about like the psychological effects of having to face your death.
Right.
And so we talked about one quote in here, and it's
What class?
it was a seminar on
Like a sophomore seminar type thing?
yeah.
What teacher?
I don't want to say.
No, that's all I need to know, actually. That's all I need to know.
I think we've already talked about who it was.
Yeah.
But anyway, so 91A, Socrates says, "I'm in danger at this moment of not having a philosophical attitude about this. But like those who are quite uneducated, I'm eager to get to the better of your argument." He keeps going on. So the question was, like, is this something that he truly would believe were he not facing imminent death at this point? Or is this something that he's kind of having, like a belief that he's having to justify at the last minute before he dies to kind of
I see what you're
reconcile
saying. Yeah.
his fears
So
and anxieties?
yeah, you're asking if it's a real belief.
Right. If it's
Or if
something
it's
that he
just-
would have believed were he not in this situation.
Yeah. I think it's clear that he would have believed this even if he wasn't in this situation. I think if you look at the other dialogues, going back to the Alcibiades, which is his first dialogue, right? And the if you look at the settings of the previous dialogues, many of the dialogues before this point are set in somewhere between 430 and 415 BC, which is 15 to 30 years before his death. So, from that standpoint, if you're willing to admit the evidence of the other dialogues as part of your assessment of Socrates, it's pretty clear that going all the way back to the Alcibiades, he's talking about the soul. The soul is of central concern to him. So this is not just an argument for the moment.
He also goes on to say, "I shall be very eager that I shall not be eager to get the agreement of those present that what I say is true, except incidentally. But I shall be very eager that I should myself be thoroughly convinced that things are so." He doesn't care about really what the opinion of the person who's discussing the things.
Right. So, I guess that's the first wave of response would be these two things: the internal evidence of the dialogue itself, and then also the evidence from the other dialogues. And that's another. I guess another point another point in relation to this is one of my introductory remarks that it's important. I think one of the things that Phaedo raises fairly clearly is that there's a difference between offering an argument, which is the best argument that you can offer and is probable, versus someone who might be critical of an argument but doesn't have anything better to offer. Right? There's that old song, "If this isn't love, it will have to do before the real thing comes along." It's an old song. I only know it was done by the Ink Spots because my dad used to always play it when I was growing up. That's how I know the song. But that's part of I think that's what's going on here. It's one thing to come up with an argument in your search for the truth, which is probable or likely or certain, versus coming up with something that just is a knockdown, drag out, so compelling that everybody has to accept it. Now, if you come up with an argument that's like certain, but not everybody has to accept it, the next question you have to ask is, right? Those who offer objections, what do they have to offer in return? So it's not, in other words, it's not enough just to say, well, that's the best argument you have to offer, and I object. You also have to say at some point, if you object, well, what's your alternative, right? What's your argument?
Wait, you can't just give reasons for why you object?
You can, but then if you give reasons for just objecting, then you risk falling into misology, being a hater of arguments.
Plato does that in the first 8 dialogues.
He does what?
He says this. He gives the bad answer and then says, "No, this can't be because of this, this, and this."
Right,
but he doesn't provide.
But he doesn't give up the struggle. I think that the important difference is he doesn't give up the search for the truth.
Okay.
So, actually, I read a book one time along these lines. Etienne Gilson, Gilson, excellent author. He wrote a book called Reason. It's a short book, about 100 pages. Reason and Revelation in the Middle Ages. And he looks into Islamic philosophy. And he says it's pretty interesting in Islamic philosophy. First you get Al-Farabi. And Al-Farabi tries to make the philosophy of Plato, somehow reconcile the philosophy of Plato with the Koran. Right? He tries to reconcile the philosophy of Plato with the Muslim religion. And Al-Ghazali is the next author. Al-Ghazali is scandalized by this. So Al-Ghazali writes a book. Have I told you guys this? Al-Ghazali wrote a book in response to Al-Farabi called The Destruction of Philosophy. And the whole point of the destruction of philosophy is to basically just destroy all philosophical arguments. And after Al-Ghazali, and why? Because what Al-Ghazali wants to do is he wants to say philosophy leads us nowhere, and given that philosophy leads us nowhere, that puts the Quran in a greater light. That makes the Quran an even more awesome, and the beauty, it shows the beauty of the Quran even more. And then, of course, Averroes, he wrote then a book called The Destruction of the Destruction. Right? And his point was basically to destroy not only Al-Ghazali's arguments, but also to destroy, in some sense, the beauty of Islam, philosophically speaking.
Is he the commentator?
Yeah.
Wait, I thought Averroes was a member of Islam.
He was. And he defended it in the end. A fascinating little fact about Averroes, apparently, he's only really known as a philosopher in the Western world. That in the Islamic world, they burned all of his philosophy books after he died. And he's known more in the Islamic world as a jurist, as a commentator on the law. In one of my other classes this semester, we read one of his commentaries on jihad. So, but that's what he's known more for in the Islamic world, are his legal commentaries, not his philosophical treatises. What Gilson argues in Reason and Revelation in the Middle Ages is that this pattern that was established by Al-Farabi and Al-Ghazali and Averroes, that basically became the pattern of modern philosophy. That some modern philosopher would come along, someone would come along like an Aquinas, and he would try to synthesize faith and reason.
What is the name of Gilson's book?
Reason and Revelation in the Middle Ages. But then after Aquinas, there would be some philosopher like a Duns Scotus or a William of Ockham who would basically, Duns Scotus would be the example here, who philosophically, he would cast aspersions on this idea of uniting faith and reason. and only to be followed by William of Ockham, who later on basically says all of philosophy doesn't lead us anywhere. I mean, kind of, I know this is just a general way of saying it, but this pattern then gets established in modern philosophy. Descartes tries to do some sort of synthesis of reason. Then at some point you get a skeptic, or you get a religious man like Arnaud or Malherbe, who are followers of Descartes that try to basically they make further divisions between faith and reason, but it's to try to promote the faith. But then you'll get someone like a David Hume, who completely destroys that unity. Or then you could say the same thing happened. The same thing has happened, and I can think of several Catholic universities where even in the history of their philosophy departments, this has happened. Or even any modern philosophy department, even political science departments, where at one point, let's say like in the 50s, there was a basic attempt to have a unified understanding of faith and reason, or a unified understanding of the tradition of the West and what that has to offer to our modern way of knowing things. Then, in the 70s, oftentimes they would hire individuals who might have been men of faith of one kind or another, but who didn't accept the Thomistic synthesis of knowledge, and who basically said there's a division between analytical philosophy and philosophy of religion. And in some sense, these men of faith, the way they justified their position was by saying, look, if I'm a philosopher who's an analytical philosopher, and I'm also, let's say, a Catholic or something like that, somehow, even if philosophy ends up in irrationality, that makes my act of faith all the greater. Right? Yeah. And then what can come along is then an atheist can come along, or just a strictly speaking analytical philosopher, and they can destroy even that attempt at unity. And that's basically the status of modern philosophy right now, of contemporary philosophy. You could say that there's a radical skepticism. And even those who are analytical philosophers, they oftentimes spend their careers just shooting. I one time read a guidebook on how to become famous in philosophy, written by an analytical philosopher, because I had these delusions that I might actually be able to get tenure somewhere as a philosopher, right? So I read this guidebook on how to become a successful philosopher. And the guy, it was just a moment of craziness. The guy basically said, all you got to do to become a successful philosopher is just find any article that was written in the last 2 years. When I took a graduate course here, kind of like a professionalization course. And this guy said, look, if you're going to quote anything in an article, you have to quote something that was published in the last 2 years. Maybe, if you want to get really radical, the last 5 years. Right? So, but his basic point was, anything older than 5 years old is irrelevant. So, in this guidebook on becoming a whack philosopher, a successful philosopher, the guy basically said, look, find an article written in the last 2 years.
No, Jeff, they couldn't even be whack philosophers, because that word came out in 94.
Right, that's right. Yeah, no, that's right. Even whack is outdated here. So this guy basically said, find an article written in the last 2 years, go through and read all the footnotes, and then get all the sites. The footnotes are the various articles and whatnot. Read those sources, and then poke holes in the argument of the article that you're reading. Use the footnotes to basically say, well, he didn't read this footnote right. Basically find 3 footnotes that he didn't read the thing right, and then you got your article. So that's how to become a successful philosopher.
Well, wouldn't it be easy to do that?
Extremely easy. But who would want to do that? Then that's the next question. I mean, the next question is, would you really want to waste your time doing that? Right? That's the existential angst of a guy like me.
No, because now the way to be productive and successful is to not do that because everybody else is doing that, right? Eventually, doing what you're doing is gonna, right?
Well, but no, the thing is that if you do like what I'm doing, it might, as Fredoso says, it might take 10 years for one article to mature. That's not going to get you tenure. I was talking with Fred.
How did McIntyre do it?
Well, the thing is, he was an analytical philosopher, so he wrote a book, before he got a PhD, he wrote a book. He wrote a book after he got his master's degree. Actually, when McIntyre was in school, it was an insult. They considered it, among his little group of friends, they considered it an insult if you actually went off and got a PhD. That was a sign that you were stupid. That if you were smart, you just wrote a book and then got a position that way.
That sounds like a beautiful mind theory.
Yeah, it kind of is. You do got to be kind of a genius in that way of doing things. And I'm not a genius, so that's not I can't do that kind of stuff.
What book did he write?
I think it's the book Christianity and Marxism. But you know McIntyre's story, right?
Only vaguely.
I don't know. Well, of course, he might correct me on this, but as I understand it, he began his career as an analytical philosopher and a Marxist. And he was... So
that's the way to become famous. Start wrong and then get...
Well, yeah, no, that's... In other words, as I understand it, this is as I understand it, and I could be wrong, but he began his career as an analytical philosopher and a Marxist. And he wrote a book, I think, called Christianity and Marxism, which was really an attack on Christianity. I think he did that for about 20 years. And then he never really lost his economic socialism. But at some point, I think in the late 60s, early 70s, he became much more, just narrowly speaking, an analytic philosopher. And then he was that way for about 10 years or so. And then in the early 80s, he became an Aristotelian. And by that point, he was kind of the world-renowned #1 ethicist in the world. He was #1 in the ECS rankings. The ethicist collegiate series, right? He was the #1 ethicist, and he became an Aristotelian. And then a lot of people started to get nervous. And then he wrote After Virtue in 1984. And then that was kind of a big splash. And it brought back, basically, his book After Virtue. It made it possible once again, because by the 1970s, everybody was an analytic philosopher. Pretty much. Or there was a small group of continental philosophers. So McInerney was a hard-headed, insignificant Thomist. The Thomists by the 70s were just this little 2% minority in American. I'm speaking just of among American philosophers. I would say now maybe they're 10%. So they're still
Making a comeback.
they're still an insignificant minority.
What's that breaking point, or what's that?
23%,
23%.
the tipping point.
Tipping point.
So he basically became an Aristotelian in 1984, let's say, and then at some point in the late 80s, I don't know what year, he converted back to Catholicism, and then he wrote three rival versions of Moral Inquiry. And I remember Martha Nussbaum, who's like the queen of modern philosophers. She is.
I like that. I like it. I'm gonna start using it.
Martha Nussbaum, she wrote a book review in the New York, I think it was in the New York Review of Books, basically lambasting McIntyre for becoming a traditionalist and an Augustinian. And she didn't attack his arguments. She basically just smeared him. And the smear campaign was based on the fact that he was no longer even an Aristotelian, and he had become an Augustinian Thomist. And it was like, and at that point he became a little bit of an outcast because she smeared him. But I think at that point he became what's called an Augustinian Thomist.
Wait, there's such thing as an Augustinian?
That's interesting.
How's that work?
It's basically a Thomist. I would say at this point, if I had to like put myself in some camp, I would say I'm an Augustinian Thomist. And smile as I say it.
I don't understand how that's...
But I think an Augustinian Thomist is basically someone who argues that there's really not this great division between Augustine and Aquinas. That ultimately, if you really are sensitive to Augustine, almost all of his arguments are leading right in the direction to what Aquinas does. And there's really not this division between the two.
You have to read Augustine in view of Aquinas, right? There's people that read Augustine the wrong way.
Yeah.
And they...
I would say Ratzinger is an Augustinian Thomist. He prefers just to read more of Augustine because he thinks that from a rhetorical standpoint, Augustine is more effective right now. But ultimately, he's an Augustinian Thomist.
So would you say man is created mortal or immortal?
Man is created immortal because man is created with an immortal soul.
I was asking what an Augustinian is.
Right. So, is that? I don't even know why I told the history of McIntyre.
It's fascinating.
Well, it's
pertinent.
It's gossip. It's philosophical gossip.
Does it still start with Averroes?
Yes.
It's it's the same thing. It's mythology. We're talking about mythology here.
Oh, yeah.
So, just going back to this point of mythology, it's one thing to understand that you have a pretty good argument, but that there are some pitfalls. It's another thing to raise objections. It's a third thing to give an alternative account, right? To explain why someone was misled, and then to offer a coherent alternative to what one objects to. My next point, I think there's another point that the Phaedo is driving at.
No, you're Jeff's slave. You must do what Jeff says.
He's not trying.
Okay, the third kind of general point that comes from the Phaedo is that fruitful philosophy.
In the first.
No, I only got the point about misology.
I think I made misology in 2 points. One was the historical reflection on misology, and the other one is just the actual statement of the problem of misology. Right? So basically, to finish off that second point would be to say that someone who hates argument is someone who will just use logic and math in order to destroy argument. Fruitful philosophy can only take place between people who are committed to both moral and intellectual greatness.
To what again?
Fruitful philosophy can only take place between those who are committed to moral and intellectual greatness. And so Simmias and Cebes qualify. And notice that they're the only ones that really engage in the dialogue in the Phaedo, even though there are other people present. Right? There might be other people present who are morally good, but they don't have the intellectual talents. And then just as a contrast, in the Republic, we have Thrasymachus, who has intellectual talents, but he's morally corrupt. And so in the end, he can't have a dialogue with Socrates. And so actually, it's interesting, in the Republic, the argument of Thrasymachus is better articulated by Glaucon and Adeimantus than it is by Thrasymachus. In other words, they can better represent the position of Thrasymachus because they are dedicated to moral and intellectual excellence. I'm not going to go into the arguments so much. I just want to make some points. I just want to continue this theme about what is good philosophical inquiry. Okay, first of all, what are the criteria of good philosophical arguments? And I think there's 7. Yeah. It's under whatever point you want to put it under, Andrew.
Is that relativism?
So first of all, in good philosophical argument, there will be clarity of expression. Secondly, we will be subtle in interpreting the work of others. Third, we will have the capacity to draw distinctions, to make distinctions. Fourth, good philosophy will construct arguments and will be able to present one's own position. Fifth, fairness in representing the positions of others or their objections. Six, straightforwardness and honesty in answering objections. And then 7 is even if in answering objections one admits that at the present one cannot satisfactorily answer all the objections. It's important to remember that I think another kind of bigger point is that most good philosophers, they know what their assumptions are. Right? They realize ultimately that there might be some assumptions that you have to grant them in order for the argument to proceed. A good philosopher knows what his assumptions are, and at some point he tries to defend his assumptions as reasonable. You might say that ultimately, right, good philosophy would be willing to admit its limits.
Exactly. I even have heard of
Ultimately, also, one summer I read, I don't recommend that anybody does this, but one summer I had to write a paper on toleration for a conference. And so I figured I would read Aquinas' treatise called De Veritate, on the truth. Because I think there's some passages in it that would help us understand what toleration is.
Couldn't you just read The Truth of Tolerance?
Yeah, I guess you could do that too.
Read what?
The Truth of Tolerance. Ratzinger.
Well, what was very interesting from my reading of Aquinas that summer, the one point that I think is worth raising right now, is that I thought going into it, that Aquinas would speak about all these strategies for toleration, right? Or all these, teachings to keep in mind. And what I discovered that was the fruit of my paper that summer is that the real way to exercise tolerance, basically tolerance, what we call tolerance is really the virtue of understanding. Right? The virtue of understanding leads you to try as much as possible to put yourself in the position of the person that you are arguing with. And the second thing that you do to live understanding is that before you engage in an argument with someone, before you have a trial, you commit yourself. This is what came out of it that was so fascinating to me. Before you have a trial, you commit yourself to a period of time in which you really work on growing in virtue. You work on growing in virtue because in the moment of the trial, you want to be in the habit of living all of the virtues. Right? So the real way to grow in tolerance, that Aquinas said in the De Veritate, this is what kind of blew my mind a little bit, that discovering the truth in the De Veritate is not simply a matter of improving your logic. Right? That discovering the truth for a trial where you might understand your opponent better and the two of you might come to understand the truth of things actually requires first that you struggle to grow in the virtues. So I presented that paper at a conference and no one understood what I was talking about. There was only one guy that kind of there was this one older guy that said, this was a conference of a bunch of postmodernists. Right? So I think I think when I gave my paper, it's like it didn't register with any of their categories. Right? So this one guy said to me, "Are you talking about accountability? Are you saying that you got to hold yourself accountable?" But that's the closest that I could get with these postmoderns in getting them to accept these categories. Would be to try to talk about accountability. So anyway,
They're the ones that are all like toleration. They don't understand your arguments.
well, basically, for them, toleration was, for the postmodernist, toleration meant being suspicious and critical of any traditional institution, so that then you could just exalt whatever is your postmodern position. So toleration was, I thought that, I mean, I don't know if they were saying this, but I thought the way they were speaking, toleration meant anything that's traditional, you got to cast suspicion on it as being totalitarian or dictatorial or dogmatic. And then once you cast aspersions on it, then you force them to be tolerant of your ideas or your teachings, whatever they might be. That was my understanding of their papers on toleration. So they were like, when they were talking about accountability, they were saying you have to attack traditional institutions and make them accountable for their actions by threatening lawsuits and things like that. That was the political philosophy of accountability. Yes.
So for a finance view, that toleration is not so much like when you're having an argument, it's like just accepting what they say, but it's like growing together.
Toleration would be twofold. Yeah, it would be trying to understand.
People are coming together.
Right, and you're trying to understand them. You're trying to understand their position, where they're coming from, or why they might be saying what they're saying.
Doesn't it require something to go like a twofold, like change almost?
Yeah, both.
It doesn't require that person too should go in virtue?
Yes. Yeah, and then ideally both people are struggling to grow in virtue.